community of colleagues, allies, and supporters around the globe are healthy and safe. Thank you to our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us, and we give gratitude to our speakers, Errol, Kelly, Latanya, and Monica, for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's Candid and Open Forum. We are honored to work with the Art Fund in many ways, including this series of 3 webinars investigating beyond statements. Together, the Art Fund and the AAMC Foundation share the goal of ensuring our arts community is diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible. I am grateful to have a partner such as the Art Fund. The AAMC Foundation offices are in Manhattan, New York City, and today I am speaking to you from Brooklyn, New York City, locations situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and the labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities, past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. The systemic violence and racism targeted at Black, Indigenous, and people of color is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. Our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working at them, funding and serving them to take action to do better. We are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make a direct or anonymous report of a violation, has been posted in the chat feature. Thank you again to our audience, speakers, and to our friends and collaborators, the Art Fund. And now to begin the webinar. Monica.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Statements, People Power. I'm going to ask our panelists to turn on their audio as well as their video. And we are joined today by Kelly Morgan, an independent curator, Latanya Autry, gun curator in residence, Errol Francis of Culture and I'm Monica Montgomery. I will be serving as your moderator, and I am an independent curator and the strategic director of Museum Hue. I want to start us with a statement to ground our efforts, and then we'll jump into our questions. We'll do roughly 60 minutes of paneling and Q&A at the back end. So, realizing that we're in an intense moment of social upheaval, our silence makes us complicit. Our inaction makes us extinct. The world is watching, and museums, arts and culture, galleries and libraries, and the humanities need to lead the charge to amplify a civic vision of social change. Community members, people of color, Indigenous groups previously rendered invisible are demanding accountability along with allies and others, holding public-facing cultural organizations accountable for their actions and demanding equity. In this session, we're going to talk about statements of demand. We're going to talk about care. We're going to talk about the violence that's often perpetuated at the hands of institutions, and what can we do to activate our people power. I also want to start with one more quote because I love quotes, and then I swear we will begin. There's a great book by Adrienne Maree Brown called Emergent Strategy, and she gives a lot of ideas for institutional change and kind of radical revolutionary personal practice. One of the things that she says that inspires this work, she says, practice futures together, practice justice together, living into new stories. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world. And again, that's a quote from Adrienne Maree Brown of Emergent Strategy. So with that said, let's dive into our questions. You're welcome to also drop questions into the Q&A, which will be answered at the end of the session. So With all of the myriad of issues and pandemics, COVID-19, public health related, the economic collapse, the labor parity demands, educational inequity, climate change, hurricanes, wildfires, global warming, and of course, the senseless slaughter of Black and Brown lives that has sparked the Black Lives Matter movement to continue on. How can we, both exhausted and invigorated, anxious but wanting action, how can we as African American, Black, African Caribbean curators, leaders, and change makers move toward action steps? What action steps would you like to see to make change? And what are you championing and what are you condemning in this moment? And let's start with Kelly.
Well, for me, thank you, Monica, first. And actually, let me thank AAMC, for just having such an important conversation. I think it's really, this is something that talk about championing, that I am championing when people are having serious conversations, because it's a lot of superficial, right, conversations that are happening in arts around these issues right now. For me, I think what I really, in terms of action steps, I want to see apology and admission, or maybe the other way around, right? Admission and apology. You have, as Tanya was saying in some of our correspondence yesterday, right? The steps toward change, have existed for decades, coming from communities of color, artists of color, museum professionals of color. And as you said in your, intro, Monica, it's like we have in the quote, right? We have to do the work together. And what I've realized, I think I've learned that lesson the hard way, over the last 6 years, of my curatorial career institutions, is that most institutions just don't want to do the work, and so that comes from a place of not being able to even admit that there's a problem in the first place, and so for me, it would be admission and apology, would be the first two things that I think particularly major institutions, need to do.
Thanks. Errol.
Yeah, hi. I, first of all, just to explain the context, I was really profoundly affected by obviously what happened in Minneapolis and the protests. But I think what really got me thinking was the statements of solidarity here in the UK from museums. They posted various statements of solidarity with the Black community. And I found these statements hollow because I thought that they were not actually engaging with their own complicity with violence against Black people. And I was particularly referring to violence during the colonial period, right? So we produced a charter for the heritage sector to actually focus a series of demands actually from the sector. And so principal among these is decolonizing the workforce and making it more representative of the diversity of our communities and our population. The really key thing was owning up to and returning artifacts that were stolen during the colonial period. And the other thing was about interpretation of collections, of making clear the colonial narrative or the colonial provenance behind collections. The other thing was the way that objects are described or artworks are described, that to remove racist and white supremacist language from descriptions. And the other thing was actually in relation to COVID-19, actually, which was that because many people of color are in the museum sector, or in the lower socioeconomic group, or belong to racial minorities who were overrepresented in the COVID-19 pandemic, that the museums should be taking steps to look after their people of color in their workforce. So there was this series of demands, very specific demands, that we felt we needed to place at the heritage sector to get them to respond in a more meaningful way, rather than the hollow comments that were made.
Thank you. LaTanya.
Hi. Yeah, thank you definitely for this opportunity. Thank you, Monica, for inviting me, and AAMC and Art Fund. I'm coming in from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm in the area of the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee people, and feel thankful to be here, and yet really challenged, right, at this moment. So I'm in this place where killing Black people is normal. You know, it's the US, and I'm thinking a lot today about Tamir Rice. I'm thinking about Tanisha Anderson. I'm thinking about Thomas Atsko. I'm thinking about Desmond Franklin. These are all Black folks killed by police here in Cleveland, right? And I am in a place where, yes, institutions have put out those kind of statements saying that they stand with Black people. No, it is a farce. I mean, there are Black people killed right here in Cleveland, of course, killed all over the United States, but killed right here in Cleveland, and they have not put any concern or care for those Black people right here. In addition to how Black people are treated, the few Black people who are employed in these places and have made a commitment to, you know, disavowing Black presence, Black existence in a majority Black city. So I had to say all of that. What we should be doing is these institutions, like what Kelly was saying, same thing kind of like what Errol is saying, there needs to be an admission, and that admission has to really require an analysis of their investment in white supremacy. They are invested in it. You know, a lot of these places have been around for decades, maybe 100 years or so, and hardly have any Black folks in any positions of power. Black people who are secure, guarding the art, which is a position of power, let's say, but in terms of shaping an institution's direction, right? Black folks are not curators in these places. That is not by chance. That is all a commitment to racism that they do all the time. They need to analyze that commitment. They need to commit to actually learning what the issues really are and to the terms that they go around saying. So many institutions use words like anti-racism. They use words like equity, inclusion, all of this. In the reality, if you pull them aside, these people who are the management and the board, they do not know what those things mean. They don't know what they mean. They are catchy words. Now social justice is in style, right? Not real social justice. And social justice is, you know, people who know what they're talking about. No, it's about a redistribution of wealth, right? It's about repatriation. It is not about just throw some terms on and then throw in one or two Black people over here and put them in a corner and make them shut up. So we need commitment to learning. And those who really created these inequities, they need to go. It's not about them taking some diversity classes. I am so sick of hearing about that. They need to go. The people who created the problems, they need to be, one, it'd be great if they just stepped down because they were just decent people and ethical human beings. But of course they're not, because they're the people who created the problems. But they need to be compelled, forced through the communities, through our associations, our professional associations and so forth, to move on. They need to step out. There are plenty of people who can do those jobs right now who actually do the work of social justice, not the pretend people who just go around sprinkling words on top of things.
Indeed. So it sounds like we are finding consensus that there's a need for apology, for admission, for analysis of white supremacy and its structural pernicious effects, for decolonizing interpretation, for fighting for labor, for kind of a COVID-19 related centering of people of color. I want to talk for a second about violence, which is a term that came up when we had our initial calls, thinking how we wanted to structure this session. I've been observing the sector and its machinations and movements around kind of pandering and the interplay between a statement of solidarity, a public backlash, and then these performative politics of, well, we as the museum are doing this and here's how. I'm also seeing it in other humanities related fields. I see in the theater field, there's a whole, I'll just call them a platform called We See You White American Theater. And they have been calling out theaters, as well as posting images of the board and the staff, many of which are mostly white, and talking about the ways that each theater needs to change. And so theaters are having to kind of respond to this and reimagine, thinking of that cause and the effect, the illumination of those cycles of violence, whether that's a posture of institutional apathy or the residue of empire, the spoils of war and plunder that many museums were started on, or just a lack of humanity juxtaposed with this need for psychological safety that workers and audiences have. There's a variety of dynamics at play in capitalist organizations that we work in, that we subscribe to, both here and in the US. So, with that said, tell me your thoughts about violence and systemic injustice in museums, both in the US and the UK. And are the institutions that perpetuate violence, are they doomed to fail or designed to shift for the long haul?
I think they're doomed to fail, to be honest. For me, particularly just in what I've experienced, I would say in the last like year and a half, I really got this, what I call, my Du Boisian moment, and realizing like the psychological violence, that it's not so much that they don't know, the issue is that they don't care. Right. And what we're dealing with, with a lot of these senior, or administrations and board members, like Tanya was saying, there's an investment in white supremacy, but we don't like to talk about white supremacy as a mental illness, right? As a systematized psychosis, so this investment in it is inherently also how they come to understand themselves and see themselves and not see us, right? Or even people who look like us. So you're asking people to change who lack empathy, right? Who lack humility, who literally don't have the psychological tools to do so, right? And I think we don't talk enough about that. Like even in these DEI initiatives, like there needs to be therapists, social workers, and psychologists, doing this work, because you have white folks, who don't know anything else because they've never had to know, anything else. So it was like this sort of light bulb moment for me where I was like, oh, I'm in, somebody else's living room saying you should really paint the walls fuchsia. And they're like, I don't want a fuchsia living room. And I'm like, but you really should want a fuchsia living room because it's sweet. And so we're talking about these things, and that's like a really facetious, right, comparison, but talking about things that I think most people, right, it's just as human beings, are like, it's the right thing to do. So everybody should want to do it. And we're not talking about the folks who really don't want to do it. And the people who, like I said, psychologically or psychoemotively, really can't do it.
Yeah. Can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, actually, I want to pick up Kelly's point about empathy, because that's what really I found disturbing about the statements of solidarity.
Yeah.
Because what it made me do was to ask myself a question, right? Which is, speaking of violence, what have museums got to do with violence? So I tried to ask myself this when I calmed down from being upset. I sort of asked myself the question, and because I'm trained as an academic, I thought, go and study this question. So I looked at this question in relation to two objects in two different museums, right? And one of them was the Benin bronzes in the British Museum. They're in other museums in the UK. The other one was a tunic, actually. It was a very simple thing. It was a Sudanese jacket that had been it had been found in the late 19th century and was put in a museum in Oxford. It had a bullet hole in the chest. And when I looked into it, I realized that the person who wore that tunic must have died, and that it is possible that the tunic was taken from his dead body on the battlefield in the late 19th century. And it was brought to Oxford by someone, possibly, it could even have been the person who shot him, because it could have been somebody in the army. But what struck me about that was the way that the object was displayed, and the complete disconnection with the violence that brought the object into the museum, right? And the complete lack of insight into the horrible, it wasn't just that this man who wore this garment had been shot dead, but that when I looked into it, there were 11,000 civilians who died in a particular battle in Sudanese, who were killed by the British. And none of this is gone into. So it's not only a failure of empathy, it's a failure of scholarship. And and it made me think that there must be a disconnect going on in these people's heads, that they could go out and put the statement, we stand in solidarity with the family of George Floyd, and you've got basically a trophy of death, right, in your collection, and you don't get the iron, the kind of, what would you say, the complete disconnect between those two positions, right? The other one was the, as I mentioned, the Benin bronzes that were taken by the British in 1897 from what is now Nigeria. And I read the first-hand account that was written in 1897 of what took place in Benin City. And you can only really describe the scale of violence as genocide. The objective was to totally destroy this civilization because the British wanted to do a trade deal with the people of Benin. The king of Benin, the Oba, said, no, I want fair terms. And they said, no, you can't dictate terms. They didn't just invade the place. They completely destroyed all of the heritage of Benin City. And then they took these beautiful bronzes, they took them to Europe and sold them in order to pay for the arms that they used to destroy the city. Now, I just thought it was the most spectacular hypocrisy, actually, the statements that were made in relation to just those two objects, right? There's many more that we can look at. But I also want to mention another type of violence, and it's inspired by the post-colonial writer Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She's an Indian scholar, and she came up with this idea, epistemic violence. So this is a type of violence that is perpetrated by silence, forgetting, othering, erasure of history. And I think that kind of violence on the level of discourse is another type of, going back to Ellie's point about empathy, is that the lack of empathy is at the level of discourse, at the level of history or curatorial scholarship. And that's another type of violence, because when I go into the British Museum and I see those objects displayed like beautiful trophies, and then I read this account, that is another type of psychological epistemic violence.
Yeah, that's really brilliant and beautifully put, and also just extremely, sad, right? What you just went through and talked about, Errol. Yeah, there is extensive violence in these places. I think the institutions, these museums, like to pretend that it's happening somewhere else, it's outside their doors, when in reality it is everything about like those choices that they're making in terms of the curatorial practices, the interpretation of the objects, how they got the objects in the first place, the care that some objects get versus other objects. It is the entire thing. And so to see people just kind of latch on to something when they think it's popular and they can, get some bonus points or something, I think, because I really feel like it was so superficial, that engagement with, we want to say something. They thought it was kind of a social media opportunity to know that our lives are just a social media opportunity in itself. And what I'll say with this question, I feel like it's complicated though, because I think we have to kind of go back and think about what our museum's about in the first place when we say, is it doomed to fail? Because in reality, I think the museum is working great. It's just like policing in the United States. People keep talking about we got to reform or make it better. Criminal justice system. It's working great. That's what it's designed to do. And I would say that the behaviors of these violent behaviors in these institutions is designed to do it. It's doing what it was designed to do from the get-go, for real. They are colonialist structures. They are structures of exclusion. They're really about power, maintaining power for certain people. And so I feel like that's not just ignorance why they don't tell the truth about these objects and so forth. It's a decision. Again, the commitment to racism, it's an allegiance to it. It's on purpose. And I also think, I think the narrative about empathy is something that really needs to get teased out and talked about, because I believe that from what I've been reading, is empathy is something that kind of came about as a construct to talk about a lot during the Enlightenment period, same time when this chattel slavery is building up, this transatlantic slavery and so forth. So I think, empathy is kind of tied to that, and the fact that, that what is considered the human, that Black folks are just kind of outside the human as a construct as well. But so there's a lot of conversations in here. one of the things I see for the form of violence that these institutions do as well is weaponizing Black artists against Black staff and Black communities.
Yes.
They do so much with that, and it will be often white management, white boards that will be saying, "Oh, we know we're bringing in Black artists with their exhibitions, with their programming, right?" And then there's also the gender dynamics. Let's be real, right? There's misogynoir that's happening, especially using Black male artists to shut up Black women in these spaces. A lot of times it's Black women that are speaking up and are getting silenced and erased regularly in these institutions. So that is something, and it's really interesting to see. It's good when we see in contemporary institutions, I'm thinking about right here, when we see artists aligning with Black staff that are really doing real work, right? Who are fighting anti-Blackness. And we do see those kind of partnerships happening. We saw that down in Miami. Can't remember the name of the artist right now, with Dr. Jeffrey Hayes as a curator, and this artist, Trinidadian photographer who was doing some work in Miami, and kind of looked at the institution and thought, is this really the place that I should be putting my work? And thinking about the anti-Blackness is just happening at that museum. And she decided to pull her work from that show that was supposed to open. That is, we don't see that a lot of times, but when we see that, I think that's some of those actions and powers that are things that we can do for that people power that you're talking about, Monica. When we do create those kind of alliances, and when we do get real about the weaponizing of Black artists against Black communities.
And can I add one really quick thing, Monica, to what Errol was saying and to what you were just saying too, Latanya. Errol, you're so right. That's just one object in one institution. And these institutions have hundreds of thousands of objects. And then as a curator, myself experiencing it, as a curator who's tried to do that, right? Who's tried to change that interpretation and had an institution say, you can't do that on days that the institution is open. And then having to get my students to subversively promote it, to get them in the doors, and to get people through the doors, for when I trying to get new fields to understand that there's no way, because my next project was that very thing, was doing that reinterpretation, centering colonialism, and saying, what you're talking about, the time, this chasm between what is actually happening to Black people, versus, the social media moment, right? Or the promotion of, look, we're doing this really cool thing around critical race curatorial analysis. And me saying no, me saying you can't not do the internal work, and hold a project like this. It's just the two, you have to do the two, and you have to do them genuinely and sincerely. And if you're not going to do them genuinely and sincerely, guess what I'm about to do? I'm about to go find some other shit to do, so going back to people power, Monica, it's just I think we, at the kind of peak, the tail end of that is I think we do also have to start saying no, to a lot of these asks. And like Tanya was saying, just to the sort of egregious, blind spots, or ignoring, the realities.
Yeah, that's
Oh, go ahead, Errol.
Oh no, I'm just sort of pausing because I'm just sort of I must tell you, I used to work in the mental health field, and I switched to working in the arts a long time ago. But I've always carried the things I learned actually from that, and just listening to people talking about empathy, it reminds me of something actually, a psychiatric label. You may have, I'm sure you've heard of the term psychopath or personality disorder. And I think that some of the acts of colonialism that are perpetrated, I think they can only be perpetrated if you have a lack of empathy. I'm sure you've all seen the 12 Years a Slave, the film, and I think what was interesting about that was the way that Steve McQueen brought out that lack of empathy. Now, And in fact, not just lack of empathy, but actually a pleasure in the cruelty as well. And just going back to what people were saying about the weaponizing of Black art and the lack of empathy, I think it's on the level of being psychopathic. Actually, how can you know that this has happened? I mean, I just still don't get it, because like one of the museums actually, after the Black Lives Matter, they put up a painting by Glenn Ligon, who is an African-American artist, and put up their statement, and yet complete disconnect with their own complicity with violence. Now that, to me, if that was a clinical situation, that would be called psychopathy. It's a very worrying. I think we could develop this as an analysis.
Yes.
This thing about empathy, actually, it's a very interesting line.
No, you're right, because like I said, it's the last year and a half of my life. It was like I've been in the twilight zone or feeling like that, because it was that for me too. Having studied that, I don't have a degree in psychology, but studying psychology like through my graduate study and undergrad study too, and it was the same thing. And I was like, these people are crazy. Like there's a very literal, because not only the perpetrators, going back centuries, but those who are in control purposely right now, who maintain it, and I will just give a very candid example, right. And not necessarily like my story to tell, but a public story now, and like listening to, Nancy Spector's response to Shadra, and you can hear, it's like, how are you denying this young woman's literal existence in the room? That's psychotic. But it's Shad's problem, for like, but she's in the, it's like, are you crazy? And then it was like watching the field respond so negatively to Shadra, not at all, where I don't know her personally, so I didn't say anything publicly, but so much of what I have said publicly recently, has come from watching that situation happen like that, right? Where it was like, how ridiculous is this, and then how are we condoning it, and because then there was she's not technically a Guggenheim curator. I was like, I don't care if she was selling bottled water in front of the building, that was her show, and when have we ever, erased the originating curator from a traveling show, and I mean, and so it was just like, just ridiculous. And then watching how that same type of psychosis was playing out in my own career, the institution that I was at, my colleagues around the country. And this is something, Tanya and I were talking about purposely when I first started grappling with it, when I was like, it really is a type of sociopathy, or psychopathy.
Sorry, I mean, this is quite interesting actually, because I think this has been written about. Now there was, I think it was after the Second World War. I think it was Adorno, it was a German philosopher, the authoritarian personality. I do remember these traits that develop of people in power and a kind of lack of empathy towards people. And I just give you a really quite sickening example that in the middle of the Black Lives Matter campaign here in England, a professor, a history professor from Cambridge University, who was at the London School of Economics, he came out with a statement that said the colonial violence cannot have been that, or the genocide, it cannot have been that serious, because look how many of these people are still here. That's what he said. He was a history professor, right? So, okay, you can say that's one person, but I think that it's more pervasive than we think.
Oh, it absolutely is. Yeah, it absolutely is.
I've encountered that kind of thing in classes. When I was a student, I took Roman art, and I heard, I've heard professors say that. So it's it's deep. It's happening, museums, but it's the training. It's the people who come and get the job, and it's so many of us are being trained with all kind of colonial, racist, sexist, elitist, like all of that is the training that we're getting, and it's normalized. It's actually, I think probably so many students don't think about it. I think about it over and over, hearing professor talk about how colonialism, or the colonizing that the Roman Empire did, how good it was for society. And I remember some student trying to push back about that and talking about it in a deep and broad way, and how the professor really shut that student down really hard. I've thought about that for years. Like, it pops in my mind all the time. Yes, these places do such great violence and do not think about their own role in it, right? And this talk about, people, well, and it's true, right, that this is the trauma that Black people have gone through because of the centuries of violence, right? And people, I don't know the name for it, the medical term about how it actually shapes our DNA because of this experience. Well, I was talking to a friend, a colleague from another museum, a Black colleague, and she said, well, I always think about, if it shaped us, it shaped white people too. That has changed their DNA. So something where I often I don't understand these people. They seem, it's very hard to even try to organize for change sometimes with white colleagues when you're trying to do something, but they won't let go of racism. Like, this is not the people at the top, just people in general. They will not let go of racism. People feel like it's helping them, it's doing something for them. And then, thinking about what my Black colleague was saying, she was like, this, all of this colonialism and racism stuff, that has shaped their DNA as well. That's in their bodies. Think about that effect. And so it is part of something that would be such deep work. And so what you're saying, Kelly, makes so much sense to me. Like, we have these trainings, and some of them, they might have some possibilities. You can get a range of things when you get these DEAI trainings, right? But typically we don't think about it as like, this should be a package deal where we're really going to be thinking very deeply, like bringing in social work.
And there are some, I think about like the Racial Equity Institute, the People's Institute. There are, particular institutions that do that, but there are so many that is, like I said, it's just this kind of like superficial kind of glaze over, like, oh, my, coworkers say the darndest things, and then HR is like, we did our diversity training. It's ridiculous.
And, I feel like that is so insulting at this moment with so much stuff that's gone down. It was always bad, but this summer it's heightened, and it seems like it. And at best, some of these places, all they got is that they're doing a diversity training. They've come up with, that's what they're doing, and that's what we get. And I'm like, no, that's good for you. You should do that. Maybe it depends on the place, right? Whatever you're getting your training from, because some of them are better than others. But also, that's just really not enough. That's not enough. And then they going back to the usual, because in reality, those things probably also, a lot of them are actually looking at how race, because I'm talking about like doing critical race theory, not you get this training over here, this separate thing. No, it needs to look very deeply at about how it's throughout the entire institution. It's throughout all the practices of these places, these so-called values, the missions of these places. All of that needs to be analyzed within a critical race kind of lens. And the accountable, that word being used kind of loosely and generally, but without, like, what does that actually really mean?
Right. I want to jump in on this, LaTanya, because you're kind of leading us to our next question, and hold those good thoughts you have, Errol and Kelly. We'll get to those too. So when we think about like museums making a statement and then aligning their actions, their practice, their policies with that statement, whereas museums say, we're going to do deep listening and we're going to do better. But what does that actually mean? Who operationalizes that? Is their funding and staff capacity aligned to that? And even museums that are now feeling an urgency to have diversity, equity, inclusion, access plans, right? Or schemes, as they say in the UK, but how has that been filtered through? So I'm wondering, getting back to people power, what we can do to transform the world and transform institutions, how can we activate our people power to push this work forward within and outside of institutions? And for those individuals working in the institutions, how do they help with the decolonization, the racial equity, labor parity, fighting back against furloughs, layoffs, things that disproportionately affect people of color? How do those folks on the inside do that work?
I think internally, and I've said this, several times in the past few weeks, right? Is that because, much like Latanya was saying, it's like sometimes it's hard to get white folks, together to kind of rally for this stuff. I've been really blessed in that way, where I've had white colleagues who have really been about, this work on the individual level and institutionally. So my advice typically to them, particularly my colleagues at Newfields now, right? It's like, okay, you have to hold their feet to the fire using their own words. Nobody asked them, senior staff, board members, whatever, and all of the kind of, all the people who were at the table to build the strategic plan, right? To build the core values. Nobody said, nobody held a gun to your head and said you had to put DEI in there. That was something that you decided to do without actually doing the work and doing the proper research to understand what that commitment actually looks like, and so it's like, I tell my colleagues, it's like, you use their words against them. They like to kind of tout, these core values or this strategic plan. I would say right here in the strategic plan, it says, and then show how that's not happening. Another strategy, that I've used is just kind of, illuminating is it ludicrosity or just how ludicrous, certain things are. That might've been a word I just made up. But for another just kind of quick example, while at Newfields, right? So we have, each institution, everybody has like their development or advancement department, whatever. Right. So the advancement department, and it's like, we don't know how to, it was this narrative or this feeling, right, or sentiment, like we don't really know how to cultivate Black donors. We don't know how to find Black, Black patrons. And University of Indianapolis, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, has one of the only, like, in one of the best, like, schools of philanthropy in the nation, right? Not only was the former director of Newfields' advancement department, a graduate of this school, so was one of the former, chairman of the board. Interestingly enough, this school also houses one of the most important institutes of Black philanthropy, right? Created by one of the most important Black philanthropic families, in Indianapolis, Black, philanthropic families in Indianapolis. So I walk into this, we don't know how to, cultivate Black patrons. And I was like, nobody thought that calling the Mays Institute was a good idea. Not at any point did any of you who are graduates from the Lilly School of Philanthropy, the Mays Institute has events at this institution all the time. And nobody said, maybe we should start a partnership with the Mays Institute. That didn't dawn on anybody. And it's like crickets, right? Right. So just kind of going back to, being in my kind of like sassy Detroit way, saying it like that, to really illuminate how ridiculous, and purposeful, right, the ignorance is, and that, then led to some steps, and I don't think a partnership exists, but there were definitely some changes that happened, right, after that was stated. And so those are my two, strategies that I've used over the years. I've done it in other ways too, but those are definitely probably like the two most recent.
Yeah, that, yes, right. Definitely using their so-called values on them. A lot of times I found they don't really know what those words mean, of course, so they'll say words like equity, and their interpretation of it is something very limited, like, well, we don't have admissions, so equitable. And it's like, no. it's so the work is so complicated because the amount of ignorance that's possible in these places is really huge. And so they might think they know what it means, and they've stopped. They haven't really done any deep work. And I don't know, sometimes how many people have pushed them to know what the words mean. I know they don't know what they mean. I've tried to do working through the institution. I try to get out of that thoughts of like inside, outside museums. There's so much talk like that, like, I really try to think about the museum as a porous thing. It should be, it's not usually, but it should be very porous, and really trying to make more connections. I always use this simile, I guess, like thinking of the museum as like Swiss cheese. So it's got holes in it, and we are reaching and we're working through it in and out, right? And I feel like I'm trying to do, and it's work, but to encourage people to see these as their places. You know, a lot of people don't even pay attention to these museums so much because they already have had these long histories of racism, these histories of exclusion, right? And of treating people in really violent ways. And the colonialism is ongoing, because even places with no collections and so forth, right? Or, oh, that happened a long time ago. No, it's happening right now in terms of course, the interpretation and everything, but also the land that these places are on. The gentrification is happening around these institutions. All of that is part of the colonial activities, right? So really, if we can make connections with other people doing community work in our cities, in the county, in our states, I think that's how we can really try to change these places. There's internal work we can do, but a lot of times I've been finding myself, typically I find myself pretty alone. There might be a few people I can talk to, but it's real hard inside to do stuff. There's certain things you can start, but I actually feel like the strongest work is really trying to encourage people who are just live in the city to see this as their institution and to be demanding real change, and for them to see that they can be, you know, use these spaces. They should be having access to this regularly. They should be able to create partnerships with this place on a regular way. And I would say supporting those lone warriors that are in these spaces that are trying to do that work, the few people that are in there, the community, really, we need, you know, I'm trying to do what I can do, but also it'd be great to have some love back with the community. And, you know, I feel that definitely by keeping those contacts. What's hard is a lot of times Black folks are brought into these spaces under fellowships and so forth. So we're just in there in a temporary way. And so we can, and it takes a while, of course, for people to get to know you, build trust if you're not from those, you know, those areas. And by the time you've done that, you're pretty much out the door. And the institution sees these, you know, diversity fellowships and so forth as, or community engagement thing. That's how they're, you know, connecting to the Black community. But in reality, as soon as those people go, that connection drops because the connection wasn't with the whole institution. Connection was just with that person. And the last thing I wanted to say is examine the funders. Who is funding this place? And start, well, we really need to start looking at a lot of that and making some, you know, it shouldn't be new to me, but it's like in the last couple of years, I've been thinking a lot more like this. And so Kelly, you were making me think about it in terms of like the school where these people got their training from and making the connection there. But really, let's start looking for organizing for change. Let's look at their funders. Let's see about like, because they're saying all kind of things in these reports back to funders that they're doing this and this and that. Let's talk to the funders about it. You know, this is when it started getting real, when you start hitting people's money. I think that's how we start creating some real change.
And I always say, I'm sorry, Errol. This is really quick. I always say, just in us being in this moment in, you know, the arts and cultural sector right now, that's really the issue, right? It's not because there was no plan B, you know, because the money had always been from these like major white, you know, families from white empire, that kind of thing. Not so much that institutions didn't plan for culture to change. They didn't plan for the money to change. And now that the money has changed, it's like, oh my God, you know, we need to get people through the door, right? And so there's like this sort of fallback on culture. Also, while discounting us as just being smart enough to be like, you ain't been here for the past 60, 70 years. What you want now? You know, you know, and so I think that there's also that, you know, as well.
Well,
let's get into.
Oh,
I'm sorry, LaTanya, continue.
I was just gonna say that's why social justice got trendy. That's why it's trendy now to pretend that they care about these things. They just try to bring in funding sources, right?
To that point, there's a lot of good Q&A that's coming through in the chat. So we're going to pivot a bit and start to answer those questions. Errol may have to leave us in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So if you have a question specifically for Errol, let us know.
5 minutes,
in 5 minutes. So if there's a question specifically for Errol, put that in the chat. But here's one that came up. I'm not going to address the questions in chronological order. Some of them have already been addressed. But one of the attendees said, what does a just cultural institution look like? What does a museum in transition look like? Dismantling seems to be a trending institutional catchphrase, but the person says they can't find much argument for anything less than disbanding museums and kind of burning it all down, although that will exact cost to BIPOC workers who've made it to positions of power. So what does a just cultural organization look like, and what does a museum in transition look like?
I'll try, since I'm going to go soon, I'll jump in with that one. That's a complicated question, actually, because I'm not sure that there are different issues with different cultural institutions, yeah? And so if we're talking about a theatre or a cinema as compared to a museum, I think that museums have a particularly tricky history. We've been discussing about colonialism and so on. So what does to answer the question, what does a just museum look like, is there are some similarities with, say, other cultural institutions, like having a representative workforce or having a program that appeals to a diverse audience. But I think that we've got to tailor it to the particular situation, you know. And so with museums, there are particular issues that we talked about with repatriation, with interpretation and so on. And we were just talking about money and funding. And I think that just as with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been demands to, in some cases, defund the police or to use budgets in a different way. I think that museums need to be much more, their funding needs to be related on their performance around diversity, right? And we don't have that in place. And I just wanted to flip back to an earlier point, actually, about people power that Monica, what you mentioned there, which is that what BLM has demonstrated is the power of people power, or the potency of people power in relation to the heritage movement. And here in the UK, we had this amazing incident where this statue was pulled down in Bristol. And yeah, that event, you know, we're still experiencing the shockwaves from that. It's a type of people power. The other thing that's been happening is that Indigenous communities have been coming to museums and making, you know, protests, as it were, or making interventions, highlighting, you know, issues about their heritage. So I think that the politicization of the museum's space, or what we might call museum activism around culture, is what we need to do to hold these people's feet to the fire. I think that gentle talking and policy in the background is one thing we can do, but you need to have this edginess from the community to get people to realize this is very serious and it matters to us all.
Yeah, I mean, one of my, you know, in terms of just kind of like a hard nose, you know, analogy or answer that I typically have for that question is, you know, when the priority of hiring white working class women to push trash cans around your galleries is just as important as hiring Black people to curate your contemporary art galleries, then we can talk about equity, right? There's way more working class white folks, you know, in the US than there are working class Black people, right? Black and brown people. You hardly ever see working class white folks on security staffs and facility staffs in museums, you know, but you scrambling to find the Black donor though. You scrambling to find the Black board member, you know, or you scrambling to find the Black curator. And again, like I said, that's kind of like just a hard nose analogy. But it's like a just museum looks exactly like that. You know, it looks like a justice thing, you know, where you are centering other communities in the same way that you center upper white middle class communities. Like, it's just, for me, I just feel like it's not rocket science. It's like the same attention, those same, because it's not like, Black people don't have a philanthropic tradition, right? Again, it's not like working class white folks don't need jobs. It's, for me, it's just not, it's just, I find it fascinating because it's just not a difficult question to answer. Like Errol, spoke, so eloquently about earlier, decolonizing interpretation, it doesn't take a whole lot of archival research. No. You don't have to spend, 20 years in Benin, to tell that story. Like, it's there. Everything that and I'm just going to be very frank in this moment, everything that white people need to do the right thing, they have. Because white people have always had everything in the first place. And so it's like, utilize what you have in the right ways, and you will get a just institution. Most of the institutions aren't just because you all just won't do the right thing.
Yes. Thank you, Kelly. Latanya, we have so many more questions to go. Did you want to jump in on that or another question?
I was basically going to be saying what Kelly said is that, we've been writing about this stuff for decades. It's not brand new. You got all of those statements. Read them, all those letters. We have articles. Kelly wrote one. They're the culture and that Errol was just talking about, the statement he put out. It's right there. There are so many statements. There's decades and decades of work about this is what we need, right? Portia Moore, you had this article, the cartographies. She's talking about the mapping that's already been there. It's nothing new. We've been doing this work. It's not been implemented because they haven't been forced to do it. They don't want to do it. We have the same kind of people in positions of power. If we want to see change, we get rid of those people. We get them out of those spots, and we put in the people who've already been doing the work. We put in the people who've already written and created the maps. If you don't do that and you keep saying, well, we just don't know how, that's a commitment to racism. It's a commitment to ignorance. It's already there. Just read the statements and do that stuff. If you are one of these people who's created the problem, step down.
And a short, a really quick addition to that, buy the book, Reinventing the Museum, right? These frameworks have existed since at least 1903, right? If you go back through museum history, now the ones in the turn of the century, they definitely like race and gender. These were progressive white men, creating these frameworks in regards to class, right? Study the origins of museum education as a discipline. One of the frameworks of museum education when museum education became a thing was equity. Go back and look at Benny Andrews's work and, Faith Ringo's, their activism work. I always forget the name of the group. It was like Black Arts Coalition, and their protests of like the Whitney and the Met and stuff in 1969. It's, you can literally, it's all there. Native, museum professionals have written about this stuff for decades. Latinx, museum professionals and artists have written about, also have frameworks, so it's not just Black, museum professionals that have done it. People have done this work. It's a very vast, body of scholarship.
Yep.
I'm going to flip to the next question. I'm going to combine two questions. So number one, someone's asking, what role, if any, do you think unions can play in dismantling white supremacy? And then pair that with, for the folks that are on the job market right now, the person says there's a lot of young scholars and prospective curators being locked out of museums. How can we participate and encourage change from the outside? Where can we put our labor?
Okay, what was the first part? I don't remember.
The first part, how can unions play a role in dismantling white supremacy in institutions? Part two, how can curators and those aspiring careers being locked out of the sector put their labor? Where can they put their labor to encourage change?
Well, the unions part, yeah, unions can require, you know, anti-racism, anti-oppression to be part of, just like that's their part of their charter. That can just be in it. That I think I've seen that with some of the union organizing this summer, but I haven't seen it actually across the board. And like I said, I know it's been a problem in some instances where, you know, people won't do that. And so they won't align with Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, Asian folks, because they don't want white people. And because of the numbers, the way the numbers are in these institutions, they've got the numbers. And so, you know, we're in the minoritized group. And if they won't give up on racism because they think it's working for them, it's very hard to organize with white people. So it's tricky. But I would like to see, because right now we don't have like a Black Curators Association. I would like to see a Black Museum Workers Association, or association for, you know, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian folks kind of coalition, because maybe that's where we can start to like some organizing we could do. But that's, you know, I'm not trying to level these groups and say that all these people work equally and that they don't have anti-Blackness going on. So I want to be careful to say that, right? I want to be careful because I do know that. And that is often put out like it's just automatically that they are all for Black folks too. And it's no, it's not. So it's really hard with labor organizing because anti-Blackness is really deep in this nation state that we're in. It's very hard to get people to stop with that. The other thing about aspiring curators, what they can do, I love talking with classes. Like that's one of my favorite things to do is talk with students and really try to give them the real deal about what they're going to experience. Students of color coming into museum spaces, and especially Black women. I try to really tell them the things that nobody told me when I was a student in my classes in art history and museum studies and so forth. Nobody told me that stuff. I learned a lot of it, you know, on courses coming into these spaces and just getting hit over and over again with racism. Knowing this, and again, this is maybe some of the organizing that they can do as students or just people who finish in the field, creating associations. I think we really need to start demanding stuff, thinking very deeply. They can be doing some of that work of analyzing funders. Start doing it. Or look at who's funding these places. Start putting demands on these funders. Start publishing that, making it very public. I think some of the stuff Errol was saying about, you know, getting communities out there. Some of it, you know, it is that policy work in the institution, but it's working across, and it's also having people just show up and do some of those things get splashy when they go viral. We need some of those images. We need people on the street in front of these institutions calling them out and saying, we aren't going to take it anymore. You don't have to have a job up in there right now. You can be demanding change from wherever you are.
Thank you. Kelly.
I think, you know, it's so funny because a lot of this particular question, it takes me back to my grandmother so much and how much, you know, her life philosophies kind of ground my work philosophies. One, you know, in terms of unionizing and stuff, you got to have is what my grandmother calls hush mouth money, you know, so have you a little part-time gig on the side or a contractual gig on the side. So when it comes time to advocate for change, you can stop working, right? The institutions can't function, you know, without us doing the labor. And particularly, you know, we're talking a lot about, you know, race in you know, this particular conversation. But I advocate a lot, you know, for my colleagues who are registrars, who are conservators, who are preparators that are catching hell, you know, in these institutions because some, you know, director has some ridiculous idea, right? Or some curator wants to bring in some ridiculous size work, you know, along with everything else that they're doing. You know, so when you talk about class discrimination, you know, those workers, you know, are catching hell right now. And it's like, we have to be able to, I think individually and collectively, you know, take care of ourselves and take care of one another. So when an institution is out of pocket, collectively we can say no and we can stop and we can strike, you know, or you can walk out.
Kelly,
you know?
I just want to say to your point, the pennant that is right behind LaTanya, which is a classic phrase from Shirley Chisholm, is so appropriate. Unbought and unbossed. You cannot buy us. You cannot boss us. We hold our own power. Yeah.
You know, absolutely. And I mean, and again, like I always say, I'm a Detroiter, so we, you know, I'm from a union town. You know, it took the powers that be damn near 35 years to dismantle that in Detroit. You know what I'm saying? Like the Detroit that you guys see now is not the Detroit, you know, that I came up in. You know, and then in terms of the, you know, students, much like Latanya, and a lot of my students will tell you, you know, I'm the same way. I'm like, here is what's really going on. You know, here is what nobody's going to tell you in their internship, you know, or curatorial assistantship, you know, at whatever major institution, you know, while you running and getting people's coffee, and you are brilliant. You know, I think we have to change our interest, you know, in working for the big white institution, as if that's better than working for the small Black institution, right? Or working for the small Latinx institution. You know, I think we aspire, you know, to Smithsonian, right? Or the New York museums, right? Or even Studio Museum, you know, for that matter. And we completely overlook, you know, the HBCU galleries, right? Or like the African-American, you know, history and culture museums that often have, you know, art collections. And most of the time have art collections that nobody's researching, you know, or doing anything with. You know, I think we need to value, you know, our own institutions more, you know, than we value these larger institutions. You know, so if you can't get the job, you know, if you can't get the position at the Met, you know, you need to go to Mokata.
I definitely agree with that. I think, you know, I've been able to make a lot of my career in small and mid-sized institutions. And even though there is no perfect place, it's not perfect there either. Sometimes that mentality of scarcity, there's anti-Blackness rife within institutions run by people of color, but it can be a softer landing for people who are looking for a resonant space. I'm going to flip to the next question. I'm combining questions because there's so many popping up. So this one goes back to kind of diversity, anti-bias training. Work with me, flow with me. So one person is saying they've been through anti-bias training, they've been traumatized, it's made things more difficult and painful, mental labor is excruciating. What's an alternative to anti-bias training? The next person is saying how to genuinely engage with diversity and representation training without negative effects. And the third person is saying, what's a good first step for museums to take besides diversity? So one saying anti-bias hurt me. What can we do? The other saying what's besides this diversity training? And the last is saying, how do we genuinely engage with that training?
I would say if the anti-bias training is working correctly, it's supposed to be hurtful. White folks ain't used to being hurt, you know, and decentered, right? Which is part of the reason why we are here, you know, constantly managing white people's feelings. That's not what anti-bias training is about. You know, it is about making you very uncomfortable with a whole lot of stuff, you know, and if you are uncomfortable in unbiased training, imagine how uncomfortable we are every freaking day. Every day. Grocery store, gas station, work, you know, you name it. We have learned, you know, right, to live, to cope in a particular way. Guess what? Welcome to the world that the rest of us have been living in for our entire lives that we didn't ask for based on white folks' feelings.
Kelly, let me just flip that on its ear 1 second. What if the person who has been hurt by the anti-bias training is a person of color who's had to kind of endure white fragility? How then should we respond?
In those situations, I just leave the room. You know what I'm saying? Because I've been in that position before myself, you know, and I just leave. You know, I don't allow. And this is just, again, going back to people power, right? Like you have to value yourself and your mental health, yourself and your mental space more than you kind of value work decorum, you know, because they will expect you, you know, to kind of deal with the guilt, right? And to kind of hear them out of all the things they didn't actually mean, whatever. Like that's on them to deal with in their own time and space. You don't have to sit through that. You know, and I would tell any, you know, BIPOC museum professional in this moment, just do not, you know, and because I have a quote up, you know, on my Facebook page right now saying no may make them angry, but it will make you free. and you have to be more committed to your own freedom and your own peace of mind and their, happiness, right? And I know that that's like hard to do if you're in, like, if the person is a supervisor, you know what I'm saying? But I don't know. It's like, I am just much more concerned, about my own well-being than theirs, so I just don't.
Yeah.
Tanya.
Yes, like, what you were saying, I was seeing it from both ways, actually, when the question came up. Yes, white people's pushing back and various things, and then a bunch of stupid questions that you're probably going to get on the side, people writing to you, sending you text messages, and I didn't know, did this bother you? Has this, I mean, all the foolishness. So in a way, sometimes, I feel like these trainings create, I've been into a range of them. So sometimes I thought they were something that was helpful, but I would say most of them are really bad that I've been to. And I kind of go sometimes like, it's good to have this, but then I'm like, oh God, this is so bad. And actually it's just making my experience worse in this place, because now I'm getting a lot of foolish people writing to me and bothering me and telling me about their confessions, white people's confessions, which are even really deep. They're not analyzing their garbage for real and getting to it, but just some superficial silliness. I just reject all of that. Yes,
Yeah,
for me, I don't need to be part of your thing. But you were saying, Kelly, about like, it can put people in a weird spot, because usually we are being marginalized in the institution, and hardly any of us. But I think, I've told people sometimes, I send them an email back like, oh, I won't be at that because I'm doing Black soul care.
Yep.
Let them figure that out. I'm doing Black soul care. And I think, if we did really start creating coalitions and thinking about collective care, right? It's self-care, but it's about collective care. If we were working more coalition wise in general all the time, we would have power. So, because I know a lot of people feel, well, you could do that, but I can't do that.
Right.
I'm in a different level job or something. And my job is a fellowship. So you could do it as a fellow, but you can't do that as, and I hear that. But I think if we were building these coalitions and we were supporting that, we could feel more like we can push back and say, I'm doing Black soul care. I'm not participating in your stuff. Some of that's for them. And it should feel uncomfortable, because you know what? I deal with it all the time. I'm in a constant state of unlearning too. I'm unlearning my investment in some foolishness that I got early on and didn't know I was part of. And it is hurtful. It's kind of this thing where it's your world is being shifted because your ideologies are being challenged. I get it, and go through it.
Let's try to get one more question in. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Kelly. Forgive me. Okay. Maybe two more questions. One person saying, what changes need to happen in curatorial scholarship? The other saying, as a BIPOC person, how to find solidarity and argue for financial compensation and empowerment. I'm going to say 1 minute each on the answer, and then we're going to wrap.
Okay. For
curatorial scholarship. Oh, salary. Okay. Okay.
So curatorial scholarship is, I think, for a lot of this stuff, just really quick, read Black art historians. Good Lord. I think so much of it is, like I said, so much of what I've been able to do, I think a lot of even what Errol was talking about, it's not deep. It doesn't require like deep archival work. It really does not. You can literally just, you can get a good Rick Powell book, or Lisa Farrington work or Kelly Jones work. You read the footnotes, you go to where those places are, and it's like, it's right there. I think for salaries, you have to negotiate it at the beginning. Create you a rubric, create you a framework with a price list, that delineates, the work that you have done. And I say this from experience because I've done it, where I've been able to ask, for a particular thing at a particular point, so in 6 months I get a title change, in a year I get a $5,000 raise, or, whatever the amount is. And you have to do it from the very, very beginning, because it's hard to, kind of come back and do it, on the back end once you've been at an institution for a while.
Thanks. LaTanya.
Yeah, I was going to say definitely the curatorial scholarship, like that Kelly was talking about, the books are already out there, right? Just like the maps for what needs to be done in these institutions is out there. Read the books, value those scholars. They're already doing the work. I just pulled one of the books off the shelf when
All right.
talking, Kelly, exhibiting Black.
Shout out to Bridget too.
100 cooks, a museum for the people. The stuff is out there. Read it, value it, institute it, make it part of your, like, just center it in your practice. And I saw recently, talking about the pay thing, someone, and I was like, I need to do this. I haven't done it, but I'm gonna start doing this. Hazard pay. Start requiring, think about, like, well, who is here? If you're gonna be the token Black person, you know, the token Indigenous person that they got on their staff, we should be getting paid more, because you're probably going, I mean, not probably, you're going into a hazardous zone. We should be getting paid more for those kind of spaces. So in addition to the things you were saying, Kelly, which are really brilliant, I need to be putting those in place myself. But also, I'm starting to think really more about building my own, for real. I can't hardly think about going into more of these predominantly white institutions. I've been in them.
Yeah, I'm done.
It's bad. It's bad
Yeah,
place.
I'm done.
I'm interested, like Kelly was talking about, think about the Black community spaces that already exist. Think about creating your own kind of networks. It's hard, but really we need to get real smart about those funding and take funding opportunities away from those big institutions that are draining and using those things, pretending that they're doing diversity, pretending that they're doing inclusion. The people who do the work it's us. We should be getting that money. We should be getting paid. So I think it's about thinking really smart about, you know, really more like as individuals and creating our own coalitions. We need to build our own things. We could be in partnership. We get those resources. So, you know, while you're in the mix trying to get your money together, because I don't come from money. I have to work it wherever I can work. But be saving your money, as Kelly was talking about, doing those jobs on the side, do everything you can, but start building our own. Like we need to stop, as a friend was telling me, we need to stop putting all of our brilliance, our Black brilliance, into white hostile environments.
And I would also say, like, don't take for granted, you know, the relationships that you currently have, you know, because one thing that happened for me is, like, you know, even kind of going back to, you know, the way in which this work kind of hurts, you know, it's like resigning in the way that I did. I was scared as hell. You know, that wasn't, I mean, you can see the confidence and you see, you know, people are like, oh, you're so brave. But it was like, dude, that night I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to work again, you know. But upon it becoming official, there were people that I hadn't talked to, you know, in who I, you know, have relationships with, but I hadn't talked to in years. I were like, what do you need? Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And it's like I am sitting in front of you right now because of my national network was like, we got you. Yes. You know, and a lot of them people ain't Black. You know, you know, right. Or I should say the majority, you know, of those folks ain't Black. You know, and I think it's like, you know, really value, you know, the relationships that you have, you know, that you may think is just a professional colleague, you know, or this is just somebody I know because we had the same fellowship together or whatever. No, it's like, you know, call on your folks, you know, the folks that are around you, you know, because people will step up for you and you don't even know, you know, that they're willing to do so.
You know, Kelly, that makes me think, I was at a workshop and the person said, don't do anything alone. That was one of the last things she said, don't do anything alone. And that's so important. Like, you know, you got people and building these coalitions, tapping on your network when they see you're out there, and then people, you know, we got a network that's going to catch us. Know that and do work with other people.
Ladies, I'm so glad that this network is forming and brainstorming and being and fueling the future. I'm happy for the network of the Association of Art Museum Curators and the Art Fund, who I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel Browning. But it's really been a joy to learn from and exchange with you. For everyone whose question we didn't get to, we apologize. Keep asking questions, keep emailing the organizations involved. We'll see if we can get some answers going, but hopefully you learned a lot here. And I'm going to turn it back to Rachel. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, LaTanya. Thank you, Errol.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Monica. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel from Art Fund. This has been an incredibly important discussion, and together with AAMC, Art Fund is honoured to be able to provide a platform to advance conversations on structural racism and to promote and support anti-racist action, decolonisation and equality in our museums, galleries and the wider sector. A huge thank you to our amazing speakers, LaTanya, Errol and Kelly, for their insights, determination and inspiration, and of course to our wonderful moderator Monica, who steered this conversation with tremendous thought and skill. We're hugely grateful to you for your time, for challenging us and helping us understand and learn. We're also indebted to our brilliant partners in this programme, AAMC, and especially to Judith and Monica for their dedication and commitment to advancing this moment and this movement in our sector. We're planning a third and final session in this programme in November, so very much look forward to seeing you all there. Do sign up to Art Fund's Museums Bulletin and AAMC's mailing list to receive more details, and follow both organisations on Twitter to stay in touch. So thank you very much and goodbye.